So thank you all for coming today. Today's topic will be invasive plants. My name is Susan Njai, and I'm the community horticulture educator. And today I have joining me Lynn Cheney. She's a new Master Gardener volunteer, and then also Linda Gayton, one of our Master Gardener volunteers. So I'll turn it over to Lynn. Take it away.
Hello, everybody. I guess where we should start is asking ourselves, what is an invasive plant? And I can start out by telling you what it is not, and it is not an aggressive plant. So there's a distinct difference, and sometimes we use the word interchangeably, but invasive plants have specific characteristics. So the first one is that the plant has to be non-native or alien to the ecosystem under consideration. So that's our yard or our county, for that matter, sometimes our state. So let's look at these few. These are daffodils, forsythia, dandelions, very common plants. They are non-native, but are they invasive? Let's look at the next slide. These also are non-native. Canada thistle, yellow flag iris, giant hogweed. These are invasive. What is the difference between the two groups? So the other characteristic that has to be present in order to call a plant an invasive plant is that its introduction into our environment has to cause, or will likely cause, economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. So economic harm, this would be to agriculture primarily. For example, the Canada thistle. There are thousands of seeds put out by one stalk, and the root systems can go as deep as 15 feet into the ground. So if these get into the agricultural environment, the picture on the right, you see looks like a cornfield, it can devastate a crop. Environmental harm. So this is the yellow flag iris. Looks lovely, right? I was just telling Susan that I see we have a clump down in our little creek here in our park, but this plant is non-native, and the rhizomes spread and form very matted clumps, which will clog our waterways, ponds, wetlands, and it'll cause a lot of problems because it will push out or prevent other more native plants that are more beneficial to the natural environment. And then environmental harm. So we all know Oriental bittersweet, right? It's lovely in the fall. I love that to decorate around Thanksgiving. But if the birds eat the seeds or they just spread, it will easily take over a woodland area. And the vines are very, very strong. You can see on the right, what they'll do is they'll climb up a tree and will suffocate it. And sometimes can actually, the weight of the vine will bring the tree down. Harm to human health. So you wouldn't normally think that many plants would be harmful to our health, but you all may have heard about the giant hogweed. This plant, as you can see, it's very large, but the sap of this plant will cause severe burns. And especially what they say is if the sap is exposed to sunlight or moisture, it will just destroy your skin. I think I read that it even can cause death, but you can see that it's not a pretty picture, but you can see what has happened to this person, and it lasts a long time. So then, just to pull it all together, an invasive plant has to be non-native, and has to, cause harm, economic, environmental, or harm to human health.
All right, thanks so much, Lynn.
Sure.
So now we're going to talk about some terminology. Lots of words get thrown around all the time. And so the question that gets asked sometimes is, what's the difference between an exotic plant and an invasive plant? Well, so let's start by looking at all plants. So if this rectangle represents all plants, we're going to break it down into two separate rectangles here. The first one is going to be native or indigenous. That means it was here, it's been here, it was here before colonizers came. So for quite a bit of time. And then the other box is going to be our non-native, our non-indigenous, our alien, or exotic. All those terms in each rectangle are synonymous. You can call it non-native or exotic. They are interchangeable. And then we also have in the non-native box, we have the term naturalized. Now, naturalized just means that it's non-native and it is here and it reproduces on its own. So something like a dandelion is a non-native plant, but it's here, it's everywhere. Something that like a daffodil is also non-native, but it's not naturalized because you don't see daffodils kind of reproducing on their own. You still have to buy the bulbs every year. So within each of these groups, we have weeds. So there are native weeds and there are non-native weeds. And within those categories, we have aggressive plants. So these are native weeds. Something that is most commonly put in this category would be something like poison ivy. Poison ivy is a native plant. It is an awful weed and is extremely aggressive. It will take over and it's really hard to get rid of. Now, if we look over in the non-native plant, that's what we call invasive. So if it's not native and very aggressive, it becomes invasive. And remember, invasive plants, they are causing economic, environmental, or harm to human health. And so that's kind of what fits in that invasive category. So if you see poison ivy, I've heard it called invasive by a lot of people, but it's not invasive because it's a native plant. And now we'll go to Linda, and Linda's going to talk a little bit more about invasive plants. Take it away, Linda.
Okay, the characteristics of invasive plants. Many invasive species, they grow fast and they reproduce rapidly. Many of them produce large quantities of seed and they thrive on disturbed soil. Invasive plant seeds are often distributed by birds, wind, or unknowingly by humans. These mechanisms allow the seeds to travel great distances. Some invasives have aggressive root systems that spread long distances from a single plant. The root systems often grow so densely that they smother the root systems of surrounding vegetation. Some species produce chemicals in their leaves or root systems which inhibit the growth of other plants around them. Invasives also lack forces in nature to limit their spread. In addition to all of the reproductive advantages, they lack natural predators. There aren't animals or insects that feed on the plants in order to keep them in check. Most often, humans don't harvest them or use them. The plants occurring in our native ecosystem lack the growth habits to compete with the invasives. When soil health is degraded, our native plants have difficulty in multiplying. Disturbed or neglected soil lacks the nutrients and structure necessary to allow appropriate growing conditions for the natives, and that leaves prime real estate for the invasives. The photo on the left, you can see how the multiflora rose has really taken over. And I'm quite certain that that's because when the road was built, the soil was disturbed. And on the right, you can see the seeds or the berries produced by the multiflora rose. They can be distributed by the birds and go many, many, many miles and become prolific. They can escape to the natural environment. Oh, this is a good photo that shows the scale of these multiflora rows. If you see the two men standing next to the hedge.
I also want to point out, so the multiflora rose is so unlimited by nature that in fact it was recommended by the USDA as a live fence back in the 50s.
Yes, and it kept cattle in, right? It was used for cattle. Yes, exactly. Because you can't get through it. I mean, it's so spiny and thorny. Invasive plants can escape into the natural environment. These photos show beautifully manicured garden of Japanese barberry on the left. And then you can see how the berries, when dropped in the forest, just totally destroy the understory. Like a healthy forest would have many, many levels of growth. And here, maybe the birds will eat some of the berries on the Japanese barberry. But the wildlife are not even able to get through that forest. So the entire ecosystem is disturbed. So the characteristics are they grow fast, reproduce rapidly, lack forces in nature to limit their spread, and can escape to the natural environment.
Thanks so much, Linda. Now Lynn's going to tell us about why we care.
So there's several reasons. I think obvious is that they destroy our ecosystems. So for example, Phragmites, Linda spoke a little bit about how the seeds can so easily spread and take over an area. So a wetland that previously may have had cattails populating the area that provided seeds and habitat for nature is being overrun by Phragmites, results in what's called a monoculture. So there's no diversity. can really destroy our habitats. Before I really knew much about Phragmites, I hadn't paid much attention. As I drive down the road, it is everywhere. And so you can certainly understand why it is an invasive species. Another interesting thing that we should consider is, as we wrote here, is confuse our pollinators. So a butterfly bush is actually an invasive species, even though a lot of people do put it in their landscape. But the problem with the butterfly bush is that it has obviously a lot of flowers on it, so a lot of nectar for the butterflies, and it sort of pulls the butterflies away from the other flowers, more native plants in the landscape and in the environment. So those native plants are not getting pollinated as they should, or at the rate that they should, because the butterflies are hanging out at that butterfly bush. But the other thing is, if the butterflies will lay their eggs on the butterfly bush, the caterpillars cannot live there. They need specific host plants to finish off their life cycle. And the butterfly bush is not the place where that will happen. So that is causing definitely a reduction in the productive success of our butterflies. So why else do we care? Costs a lot of money. Well, what costs a lot of money? We have to get rid of some of these things if they're clogging waterways or in our agricultural environment. So as you can see, there's billions of dollars that has to get spent each year to manage these invasive species. And as it says there, it is worldwide, not just the United States, but everywhere. That's why we care. It destroys our ecosystem, confuses the pollinators, and costs a lot of money.
All right, thanks so much, Lynn. So now that we know what an invasive plant is, we know what characteristics they have, and we know why we care, what can we do about it? Well, you're all here today, so that's a huge step, learning more about invasive plants. So once you learn about it, you can go out in your yard and identify which plants are invasive. And here is a really great guide that you can use. It's called Mistaken Identity, Invasive Plants and Their Native Lookalikes. So this page right here is all about Norway maple, which is an invasive species. That was planted widely as a street tree. So undoubtedly, if you walk out of your house right now, you could probably see one, especially if you live in a city or a small town. And here's a great guide so you can tell its difference between a native tree like the sugar maple. So I highly recommend this guide. So once you're able to identify the plants in your yard, you should learn more about them, right? It's one thing to identify a Norway maple, but it's another thing to learn more about it. So, the questions that you should ask are, what is its life cycle? How does it reproduce? Because those are really important questions when it comes to how to control it. So let's look at a few different life cycles and reproduction methods. So here we have a lovely field of Japanese stiltgrass, which is an awful invasive, and it is an annual and it reproduces by seed. Seed is the only way that it reproduces. And then as it's an annual, it dies off every year. And then the seeds that are in the seed bank in the soil will resprout. So that's really great to know. That means if you can get it to stop seeding, if you can cut it off before it seeds, or if you can kill all those seeds in the seed bank, because of course they last, they're there for several years. It's not just a one-year thing. You can control this awful invasive species. Then we can look at something like this is garlic mustard. It is a biennial. Biennial means that it has to go through 2 years before it flowers. So here you can get rid of it in the first year. Then it will never flower because it has to overwinter before it will send those flowers. So in the first year, it forms like a rosette, kind of close to the ground. And in the second year, they become very apparent because they shoot up stalks and flowers on them. So this is one, if you keep an eye on it and get rid of it in the first year, you won't have any issues because it also reproduces exclusively by seed. Then we have something like goutweed. Now goutweed has all these beautiful flowers. It's highly invasive, but it doesn't really reproduce by seed. They've said that it can produce some viable seeds, but they've really never seen it reproduce by seeds. It reproduces by rhizome. And so the only way for this to spread is by contaminated soil. So this is really great information to know. It means you can't get it in your property unless you're putting some soil in. And once it's in your property, you don't have to worry about it spreading by seed. You just have to take care of its rhizomes. Another perennial that is a bane of most people's existence is Japanese knotweed. Now this one, unlike the goutweed, does reproduce by seed. Here are all these beautiful flowers that pollinators absolutely love. And then it produces all of these thousands and thousands of seeds. So with Japanese knotweed, it's like a triple threat. First, we have our seeds. Then we have these rhizomes. So if a rhizome breaks off in a waterway and floats downstream, it can be embedded and sprout a new plant. Or It also reproduces by stem fragments. So we got seeds, rhizome, and stem fragments. So if you were to take this Japanese knotweed and you were to cut a section, as long as it includes a node, so one of those circles around the stem, if it includes that, it can embed in the soil and sprout. So something like this, it's really important to know that you have to make sure you take care of that plant after you cut it down, because it can sprout again, which is not the case with something like Japanese stiltgrass, goutweed, or garlic mustard. Any part of this plant will reproduce. Here are some really great sites where you can learn more about the invasive plants, and these are specific to our area. You can go on, look at invasive plants on, a US website, but this is the Lower Hudson Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management. So we'll have ones that are specific to here. It's a great website. And then also the New York Invasive Species Information website is another great place to learn specifically about things here. Also, because they are local, all of the management options will be available. If you look at other states, pesticide regulations vary from state to state. So these will have things that are available in New York State. So we've identified them, we've learned more about them, and now we want to remove them. So why don't I just cut them down? It really depends on the plant. So we're going to look at two different trees and see how very different techniques need to be used. So let's go back to that Norway maple. Norway maples are these beautiful street trees. You probably see them in the fall. They're also in the spring, they're one of the first things to leaf out, which is one of the issues with them. They escape with all of these, all of these seeds, they escape into the forests. And because they're the first thing to leaf out, they basically smother, or with their shade, any possibility of things growing under them. There's also, this is Crimson King. They're also extremely popular. It's just a variation on a theme. It's still Norway maple, just because it looks different. Now, luckily with Norway maples, they are very easy to get rid of. You just cut them down. Once you cut them down, the stump may put out some new sprouts. You can cut them off. You can treat the stem with a herbicide, or you can ground up the stump. But that's it. All you need to do is cut it down. So very simple to get rid of. Now let's compare that to the tree of heaven. Now, tree of heaven is also extremely prolific. Here it is, it grows anywhere. If you've ever read the story, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, they're talking about a tree of heaven. So it grows basically anywhere. I've seen it growing in gutters. It has this very distinctive bark. It also puts out, it makes a full-grown tree can put out 300,000 seeds a year. That is a lot of seeds. And they have, their stamina, so they have those wings and they flutter off into the distance. So they spread that way. But also, fortunately, tree of heaven puts out suckers. So these are basically duplicates of itself. It puts out a root, and then a tree will grow from that root. And this can be up to 50 feet away. So that's another way that it reproduces. And if you were to cut the liaison between those two, you would have two trees. So a lot of people will go out to their tree of heaven and they'll cut it down. Now, the problem with that is you're not controlling the roots. And so this will actually cause you more problems than you had in the first place, because all those roots will put up more and more suckers. And instead of having one tree, you'll have tens, if not hundreds of trees. So that's not a good option. So what can you do? Here is where knowing more about the plant is really important. For most of the year, the plants are taking nutrients that have been stored in their roots, all the sugars, and they're moving it up into the trunk so that they can continue growing. So they're using stored sugars to put out more leaves, to grow taller. But then from July to September, they're taking those sugars and they're putting it back into the roots. Once they have flowered, that's their goal, to give them some human characteristics. Their goal is to flower. Once they flowered and produce those seeds, they start storing nutrients because they know they have to get through the long winter. So from July to September, they're moving things down into the roots. And that is the perfect time to treat it with a herbicide. If you were to treat tree of heaven with a herbicide while they're moving nutrients up out of the roots, you will not kill the roots. But from July to September, after it's flowered, if you cut the tree down and treat that stump with the herbicide will be transported down into the roots and it will be able to kill the plant. So this is why it's really important. You have to identify the plant, make sure you know what you're dealing with, know how it reproduces, and then also know a little bit about, its life cycle. Then once you've killed the plant, you want to discard it, the plant properly. So if you cut down lots of Japanese knotweed and you just kind of let it sitting there, especially if it's near water, it could wash away and sprout other places. Our recommendation usually is to put things in black plastic garbage bags and throw them in the garbage and send them to the landfill. We don't recommend composting them because a lot of things do sprout from rhizomes. We also, if you really want to make sure it's dead, if you take those black plastic garbage bags and you put them on your driveway in the middle of the summer, if you're doing control in the middle of summer, it'll really fry them. So even if the bag were to split open, the things inside are so fried that they wouldn't be able to propagate. And then also what's really important is you want to replace it with some native alternatives. or other alternatives, but we highly recommend using some natives. If you cut down a tree, you remove Japanese knotweed from an area and you just let it sit, either the Japanese knotweeds are going to come back, or you're going to get something like Phragmites taking its place. So we had a group bring in some, they had an invasive plant, and I stress to them how important it is to think about what they want to put in its place, because if not, you're just going to get something just as bad or even worse. So there are some really great places to find native alternatives, especially if you really like the characteristics of your plant. So this is a sumac. It looks very similar to tree of heaven. This is a native plant. And so this actually will list the invasive species and list native alternatives that are very similar in structure, in shape, in color, in form. So if you really like that Japanese barberry because of the purple of the leaves, this will give you some recommendations on things that look similar to it. And another great one is put out by Cornell Cooperative Extension in Suffolk County. It's called Finding Alternatives to Invasive Ornamental Plants in New York. So both of these websites are geared to where we live, which is great. But that's what we recommend you do. Get rid of it, and then you make sure you replace it with something that you want there. So, I recommend, I hope that you'll all go out into your yards and kind of look at your plants and figure out if you have any invasive plants, because maybe they're not a problem in your yard, but if they have berries, the birds are taking those and spreading them elsewhere. They may look beautiful, but there are consequences to their existence in your yard. So learn more about them, remove them, make sure you do it after you look up how to do it, discard them properly, and then you can replace them with native alternatives that will benefit nature here, all of the insects, all of the vertebrates, everything.